I want to bring in Niigaan Sinclair now. He's an associate professor in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba and a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Niigaan, thank you very much for talking to us today. What was your reaction?
Thanks for having me.
What was your reaction to hearing that number? As many as 751 unmarked graves. It feels as though it's only been a couple of weeks that people were reacting to 215 in Kamloops, and now 751.
Well, you know, for someone who's been involved with the issue for such a long period of time, of course, my father was the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, I've gone to TRC events for decades, even before there was a TRC. And so certainly I knew about these stories. None of this surprises me. I'm far more interested in the fact that the Catholic Church consciously removed the headstones from those sites, which shows you that this was not just neglect. This is a cover-up. This is a situation in which the church not only has withheld documents in the past or claimed they've been destroyed only to have them sent off to what the Chief Delorme said was Winnipeg. But there is a conscious effort to cover this up so that Canadians don't find out the truth of what happened at those schools. That is a key thing here, which demonstrates a culpability and an action involving criminal intent that is underway by the church, is funded by the federal government. This is the key here in the story for today. I know that it's very traumatic. I know for Canadians, this is perhaps a new discovery of information involving the massive amount of violence that happened at the schools. But the key here is that the story is about criminality, and that there is elements within that are undoubtedly, for years the TRC had difficulty trying to make the claim that this was a genocide, because they had to claim it was cultural genocide because they couldn't prove there was a mental intent. This covering up of residential school unmarked graves, or graves making them unmarked, is an indication of criminality.
So what does that mean in terms of accountability, in terms of something from the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church being held, in your view, criminally responsible?
Well, the fact is that we're not going to be able to find out exactly what happened to those children. We're not going to be able to find out exactly often who those children are in those graves, because in some cases this is over a century old. But it is a matter of a point of conversation on Canadians of what do we do next. Like, in every Canadian community, there's a Catholic Church. That means that every Canadian has connections to what the Catholic Church has done and continues to do in this society. We live in a society in which the Catholic Pope refuses to acknowledge that this harm has taken place, and has said things like, well, you deal with it over there, Archbishop, here in Canada. You know, there are many Indigenous peoples who have very deep ties with the Catholic Church, very positive ties with that church. And so if there's an effort by the Catholic Church, if anything, to try to change in this regard, it's to encourage their leadership to take responsibility, to take actions to rectify this beyond simply what was happening during the TRC. But it's also about Canadians recognizing what has been the foundation of this country. There's talk of course, many people talking about canceling Canada Day. In 1 week, there's going to be celebrating this nation's birthday. This is not the time for fireworks. This is not the time for talking solely a one-dimensional maple syrup narrative about here's the heroes of this country, here's who they are. The fact is, those heroes, people who have been held up in buildings and names and statues throughout the country, they have perpetrated incredible harms and genocides. And if we do not have a conversation of what that means and what do we do now about it, we'll just be continuing the ignorance and the obliteration that resulted in the erasure of children's remains, those graves which then became unmarked. In the same way that the headstones would be removed, we would be not telling the story of what this country is fundamentally about.
Mm-hmm. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, put out this morning saying he was terribly saddened by this news, and saying no child should have ever been taken away from their families and communities and robbed of their language, culture, and identity. What are your thoughts on the Prime Minister's statement from this morning?
Well, I applaud the Prime Minister for taking leadership in this regard. I mean, I think back to how in the previous government to this, we couldn't get the Prime Minister to show up at a TRC gathering. And the Prime Minister previous to that didn't show up ever to respond to the calls to action. The previous Prime Minister. This Prime Minister, I think, takes risks in the areas of trying to create relationships with Indigenous peoples. The problem, of course, is that words are fine, but actions are another thing. And we still have boil water advisories. We still have the issue of murder missing Indigenous women and girls and the calls for justice, which have not been enacted upon from the very inquiry that the government called for, the government created. And then on top of that, we have this issue involving the real issue around residential school sites that continue to have burial remains throughout their sites, and there are hundreds more, thousands more of children that have yet to be found. The fact is that it's not just the federal government that has to step up, it's provincial governments, municipal governments as well. Every Canadian should be a part of this search. It's not just about my nieces and nephews, but yours as well.
Can the government, the NDP, has negotiated to try and get the documents from the Kamloops Residential School if the Catholic Church and some of these orders are reluctant to hand over these documents, and there could be concern that they are being destroyed or have been destroyed. Is there a way to kind of compel these records to be handed over?
Well, here's the one thing that I've learned. For years and years, Canada said we can't deal with the boil water advisories. We can't deal with the issue of murder missing Indigenous women and girls. It's too expensive to deal with the poverty in this far-off Indigenous community. But claiming things like we don't have the money. But then a pandemic hits, and then billions of dollars are found in seconds. So what does that tell you? That tells you that political will can produce anything. You could produce subpoenas for churches to hand over documents. You could go in there yourself and require those documents to be produced. Unfortunately, what you probably find is you'd find that the churches had porous records. They had records that they claimed to be private, things like missionary records or journals, for example, that talk about people's names. And there may be some need to work with those privacy concerns in some way. But the fact is really, do we really want to produce that kind of relationship with the churches that's acrimonious and divisive? Or do we want the churches to stand up for themselves, to be the places that Christians purport them to be, which is places of kindness, goodness, the right thing to do? It seems like the churches are contravening their own belief system by continuing to be silent on the issue of producing documents or being resistant in any way. It should be the churches, it should be Christians who attend these churches who demand accountability in their own institutions.
What about Pope Francis and an apology that has not come and may never come?
Well, frankly, I think that the Pope is not interested in relationships with Indigenous peoples, particularly here in the country, because he has yet to in any way make an expression of apology, but he has expressed sorrow. So that tells me that racism is real and that racism is very much a part of the church, in that Indigenous peoples are still seen as second-tier Catholics, not just second-tier human beings, but second-tier Catholics. And I think what that does is that tells Catholics that there is a real cancer within the Catholic Church, going all the way up to the very echelons, a real attitude that is based within stereotypes and misperceptions and, yes, violence, that I think Catholics should look twice at their own institution.
I just want to understand what you mean. I think you mean by him expressing sorrow and not an apology that somehow Indigenous people who have been killed, who have died at these residential schools are just not as, are not as important as humans, that they are not as deserving of an apology? Is that what you mean? Yeah.
I mean, many of these children were baptized. Many of these children were in Catholic traditions. Many of them who were, in the case of Cowsis, these were children who were likely considered Catholics, which is why they were buried in a Catholic cemetery. The fact is that the upper echelons of the Catholic Church are not taking leadership on this issue. And what I always say is that you can either show leadership or be led to the truth, to the right thing to do. And I think that Catholics should be, if they're not going to be led, then they should be leading their own church to the right thing to do.
What did you make of one of the things that Betty Nippy Albright, the NDP critic, Regina, Saskatchewan, Regina, said, and she said about the future, whether she's hopeful, and she said, well, Saskatchewan is a very racist province, so I don't know.
Yeah, I completely understand a sense of apathy today. I completely understand why MPs like Leah Kazan, who comes from our territory here in Treaty 1, have expressed such sorrow and have a great difficulty in working in an institution, meaning governments here in Canada, where you can see change, where the humanity of Indigenous peoples are constantly under debate as if it's a political issue. Or you have a premier in Alberta who's saying things like, we need to have as many fireworks as possible on Canada's Freedom Day, and that we're somehow seeking to cancel Canada because we're talking about having responsible conversations on Canada Day. The fact is that we have a deep issue in this country involving racism and the ways in which Indigenous peoples are perceived as lesser than citizens. And that goes with every element of every government, of every part of this society. But I also have tremendous faith in the ways in which everyday people have reached out to me today. You know, we have to remember that during the press conference today, when the chief spoke, when Chief Delorme spoke, the first two questions in that press conference, one was from a German reporter and the other one was from a Spanish reporter. They're talking about the world watching Canada. And if Canada's not ready to change, I think the world will require Canada to change in many different ways by the pressure that will be placed on. I saw a story on CNN. I saw a story on other media outlets like The Guardian and so on. My first call today was with Al Jazeera English in Qatar on my first media interview for today. The world is watching Canada, and like I said, you can either lead or be led to what the right thing is to do. And I think that the world will put enough pressure on Canada because they're understanding the truth of what this country is all about. And it may be uncomfortable for Canadians, but to mature, to grow as a country, they've got to face the reality, which is this country has been built on a foundation of genocide. It's not just the maple syrupy national narrative that's been sold to Canadians. It's also a story about blood. It's a story about pain, and it's a story of what do we do now about that.
Niigaan, appreciate you taking the time very much. Appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Yeah, Miigwech, thank you very much.
Niigaan Sinclair, an associate professor in the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba and a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press.